Right, here we are where we left off in part 1, and if you haven't seen that, I recommend watching it to bring you up to speed. So let's get started, and the first thing I want to do is some housekeeping, and I want to rename debug to designing, because that's essentially what we're using it for. So select that, select next to currents until they're all selected, and then type designing. Now that that's done, let's alt drag on this and make these private let. Private let. Because they are private constants, they don't need to be visible to the world. And then I want to go down here, make a couple of changes. I want that to be Y-scaled, because we do actually just want to reflect this in the Y-axis. It's nice to be specific. And I also want to control that, not only if we're at the top, but also if we are designing, we want it to be in its original place. So is top or designing, just like that. Okay. There are two properties that I want to pull into our sticky toggle, and they are the size and the threshold upon which is going to base its stickiness, which we're going to call the sticky threshold. So let's add them now. Let size, which is CG float, and sticky threshold, which is also a CG float. We now need to pass them in, but we need to know what to pass in. And we're going to wrap this in a geometry reader so we can give it values based on the canvas that we're using. So we're going to put a geometry reader in here. And the size is going to be 0.3 times the width, and the sticky threshold is going to be 0.3 times the height. We are also going to ignore safe areas on that. So when I resume, it should pop up to the top, and it's still the same size because we haven't sized it internally yet. And we're also going to wrap the toggles implementation inside another geometry reader, which will come in handy later on, like this. Geometry reader, we'll take everything in there and move it up, get rid of that line. And then the size that we've just got here, we're going to set as the frame. All right, that's what we'll do for now. And as you can notice here, it's popped up to the top left. And we really want it in the center, don't we? And this is one of the problems with geometry readers. They tend to mess with your layouts when you're dealing with views that aren't greedy. There are two things we're going to do to solve this, but I do recommend watching the episode on geometry readers because it will clue you in as to what's really going on here. But we are going to put a V-stack inside this thing, and we're going to use a V-stack and a spacer to place it at the top, and then we're going to give it a greedy size so it fills up the entire geometry reader. So we'll say V-stack like that, and we'll put in a spacer at the bottom, and then we will make that V-stack greedy in both dimensions. There we are. So now it's set up in the center and it's nicely placed at the top of our view. Right, so to build the rest of this toggle, there are 5 areas we're going to cover: the gesture, the offset, the scale, the stretching, and the animation. We're going to do them one by one, so it's all nice and clear what's going on. The first thing is the gesture. And we're going to add a drag gesture to this, and in the form that we're using them, which is the more intuitive form in my opinion, we're going to use the onChanged and onEnded functions as opposed to the updating function, which we will get into in a future tutorial. OnChanged expects a closure that takes a drag gesture value type. And if we can provide that as a function, we can just pass that function in. The same thing goes for onEnded. So let's put them in now. And I like to put my functions under the body. I also like to make them private when I can. Func onChanged, and it takes a gesture of type drag gesture value. Doesn't return anything, and I'm just going to leave it like that. The onEnded one is going to be exactly the same for now. So we'll just call it onEnded. And now adding a gesture is very clear and easy. Like this. Gesture, drag gesture, minimum distance of 0. So for onChanged, we'll give it onChanged. And for onEnded, we'll give it onEnded, like that. Now, if you're new to gestures, I do intend to do a series on gestures explicitly, so I don't want to get too bogged down in that right now. But if you are new to it, then SwiftUI Lab does have some great resources on this topic, so do check that out if you are at all confused by it. So what this actually means is that we are creating a drag gesture that is going to activate once we have passed a minimum distance of 0. Right, so it's immediately going to activate. And when it changes, it will call the function that we are supplying for onChanged events. And it will call the onEnded function that we've provided when the drag gesture ends. And what we want to do is we want to record the translation, how far it has moved, specifically in the Y direction. All we need is a state private variable, and we can update our value in the onChanged and onEnded functions. So let's do that. Let's put in our Y translation. SPV, Y translation is a CG float of 0 to start with. And onChanged, all we do is say Y translation is equal to gesture translation Y. So that's where it's going to be when it's changing. And when it's finished in the onEnded function, we just want to set it back to 0. So Y translation equals 0. So in order to make Y translation make sense to us, we're going to provide an offset for that translation as a computed property. And I like to put computed properties above the body. So private var offset for translation, which is a CG float. And for now, we're just going to return the Y translation. Now we need to use that computed property in our shape in such a way that it moves it. So what I'm going to use is the Y offset modifier. I'm going to put it here. Y offset, offset for translation. Now let's resume. And we'll play. And look, we've got a shape that is at least following what we're doing. Now, if you notice, it pops to the top when I let go, which is great. That means that the onEnded function is working correctly. It is resetting the translation to 0. There's one thing we need to account for. I don't want to be able to push it up. What we're going to do is put a guard on this, and that guard is going to be controlled by a computed property, another one, which we're going to call valid translation. Let's put it here. Private var valid translation, which is a Boolean. That is going to be whether or not the Y translation is greater than 0. And then in our offset for translation, we'll put a guard here. Valid translation, else return 0. And then I need to return that. And then if we resume, I shouldn't be able to push it up anymore. I can pull it down. I cannot push it up. Lovely. Now let's define the state that is going to control whether or not the toggle is at the top or the bottom. And we're going to call it at top. So let's put it up here. At top, true. All right. There is another property that we need to get hold of in order to make this work. We need to know what half the screen height is. And if you've watched that episode on Geometry Reader, you'll have a pretty good idea on how we're going to do it. I'm going to put an onAppear modifier onto a VStack and use that to extract half the view height from the Geometry Reader. So we'll put it on the VStack just here, onAppear, and we'll say half the screen height is equal to geo height scaled 0.5. So then we take that, we add another one up here. We'll call it half the screen height. We'll set it initially to 0. But once this view appears, it will be set to half the screen height. Once we cross the half screen height barrier, that is when we switch from the top to the bottom, but only when we let go. That is a very important point. So before we go any further, I can now create a utility function that is going to tell us whether or not the location of a gesture is in the top or bottom half of the screen. We'll put it here. Private func is top half. We'll give it the same gesture here. Give it the same thing. And that, of course, returns a Boolean. And all we do is we say the gesture location, y, is less than or equal to half the screen height. All right? So now we know if it's in the top half of the screen, so that can drive whether or not it should go to the top or the bottom when it's released. So all we do is we say at top is equal to is top half, and we pass in the gesture. Okay, so at the end of the gesture, we are now in the correct state. But what are we going to do with that? So far, all we've done is set some state. And the result we want is that we want that square to be at the bottom of the screen if isTop is false. So we can use a conditional modifier on this, and we use y_offset if not at the top, and then I'll show you the calculation. So we're going to say that the y_offset if not at top is the height minus the size. Now, if we offset it by the full height of the screen, it would end up under the screen. So that's why we are subtracting the size. But as you can see, it's a constant. It's not going to change. Let's set another state property up that is going to hold that one. And we'll call it offset at bottom is the height minus the size. And we'll make another property out of that one. Offset at bottom, which starts off at 0. And then instead of that, offset at bottom. So let's resume. Okay, so it works going down, but not going up. And the reason we can't see the offset going up is because of the guard we're using in the offset for translation. So let's change that to take into account whether or not we're at the top or the bottom. So we change valid translation and we say, if we're at the top and it's greater than 0, or if we're not at the top and it's less than 0, like that. Now when we drag it, we can drag it in both directions, okay? And we've got the state doing exactly what we want. And look, you have to go past halfway and it works. Okay, so before we finish today, now that we've got a bit of state that we're interested in tracking, I'm going to put a layer of debug on this. And that's another reason I'm using designing instead of debug, because we want to be able to see how these values are reacting. It makes it a little bit easier to understand what's going on. So I'm going to put this lot in a Z stack. Like that. And I'm going to put it around the V stack. And then under the V stack, if we're debugging, let's put in a constant for that. Then I want to actually see what the value is. At top. At top. And if we resume, we should be able to see that value. And then as we drag around, once I let go, you can see that that value changes at the end of the gesture. Now, we don't want that debug information to be there if we're designing our shape. So let's make sure that it's not designing, like that. Okay, that's a good place to stop for this episode. And in the next episode, we're going to be dealing with the scaling, the stretching, and the animation. So join me for that. It's going to be brilliant. If you're liking it so far, remember to give it a thumbs up. You keeps me very happy, of course, and helps people find the channel. And if you haven't subscribed yet and you want to see the next episode, and I was going to say conclusion, but I don't know if it's going to be the last episode at this point, but consider doing that, and it's rather likely that you won't miss it. If you found any of that hard to follow, do let me know in the comments and I'll try to clear things up, or reach out to me on Twitter at CodeSlice and I'll do the best I can to help you. If you have any other comments or suggestions, please leave them below. But in the meantime, thanks for joining me. See you next time.